Hey, good Monday morning, everybody. BAM Weather Meteorologist Brett Waltz here, giving you a long-range forecast update, guys. I hope y'all are doing well. This morning had a great weekend. Many people still digging out from multiple snow events last week across parts of the Ohio Valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the Deep South. And want to start here because take a look at this, guys. Going to be substantially colder than normal for really the vast majority of the country as we work to the middle to the latter part of January. Another big cold blast coming, especially as we go into next week. We'll have another couple of storm systems that we'll need to track as well. But guys, if you're looking for winter weather, you're looking for cold, it's here. Probably some of the most consistent cold that we've had this time of the year in several years, if not dating all the way back to 2014. And I do see a lot of similarities in the pattern ahead to that 2013-2014 winter. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we go throughout the video. Before we get to that, just want to touch on the pattern as we work over the next several days. Taking a look at the current setup across the country right now, you can see all the lake effect snow and some clipper activity up into the Great Lakes in the interior northeast. We'll have another little clipper system that kind of tracks through the Ohio Valley as we work over the next couple of days for some light snow chances. But in terms of big storms, the next one that we'll need to at least monitor for the risk comes more into the weekend. But I would say that's very up in the air at this point for a couple of reasons. I want to talk about that kind of to start things out because this will be the next potentially impactful storm if it can come together. And again, that's a big if at this point. And the reason for that is because data is struggling to see a phase of the northern jet stream and the southern jet stream. This is as we work into Friday, and then as we work into Saturday, what you'll notice, this is what we call vorticity. It's basically giving you an idea of upward motion in the atmosphere. What you want to see happen to see bigger storm systems is for this northern piece of energy to come together with this southern piece of energy. But what happens on the latest data as we go into the weekend is the two never really come together. You can see they're completely separate all the way through Saturday of this upcoming weekend. You can see the northern piece over the Great Lakes, the southern piece well down to the south. The 6C GFS eventually does try to bring these two pieces together at least a little bit, but by this point, the air is very dry, it's suppressed. You probably have some kind of wintry activity in the northeast, but aside from that, it's not a big storm system. So to get a big storm system, what we're going to need to watch is to see if this northern piece can turn a little bit further south. Can the southern piece turn a little bit further north? Can they come together and produce a bigger snowstorm over this particular region? It's not out of the question. One thing I will note about the system that we had late last week, one thing that model data really struggled to see was how far south this northern piece of energy got with the tropospheric polar vortex. If we have a similar trend and this ticks further down to the south, it would open the door for the threat of a swath of snow as we go into the weekend. Not guaranteeing anything at this point. I think it's still very much up in the air. It's certainly a setup worth monitoring, but it's not a slam dunk forecast by any means at this distance. So it's just going to be one that we have to watch and we have to trend as we get a little bit closer. Looking at the pattern beyond that storm system, guys, take a look at what happens. Number one, this is about the 18th of the month, so this Friday into this Saturday, a very strong ridge of warmth and high pressure here building over Alaska. This is going to allow for a dump of Arctic air right into the United States. In fact, if you follow these lines, look how these lines are coming straight from the Arctic Ocean all the way down into the United States. And so the air heading towards the U.S. as we work into this weekend and into early next week is directly from the Arctic Ocean. It's the coldest air on the planet moving towards the United States and really impacting much of the U.S. When you get an upper level pattern like this, guys, this is one that's going to flood extremely cold air well south into the country. In fact, if we look at our anomalies here, we zoom in. This is as we work into Monday of next week. You're talking about 15 to 20 degrees plus below normal for the vast majority of the central part of the country, down into parts of Texas. That's something to keep in mind from a heating demand standpoint. When you start getting these types of colors down into the deep south and into Texas, that's always a concern for those areas in terms of energy demand. We'll really spike that up. But we're talking about much of the country seeing these much below normal temperatures. I'm not going to get into exact specifics of what these temperatures are going to be because it's still 8 days out. And I don't want anybody to hold me to, oh, you said negative 10 degrees or you said negative 15 degrees. The key here, guys, with a general idea at this distance, temperatures are going to be extremely below normal. You can get more specific details of what the data is trying to indicate right now in the Clarity platform and our Clarity app. If you have the Pro version, of course, you can look at the chances to see kind of the extreme potential with those temperatures. As we continue to go through here, the cold will linger, all the way out through day 10, day 11. I'm going to switch over to the GEFS here because what I like that it does is it kind of reloads some of this cold to the north, but, all the way out through the end of the run, the pattern for the United States is colder than normal pretty consistently. The core of the cold is going to come kind of in the medium range late this weekend into early next weekend and throughout next week. But really, we don't see a big change in this type of a pattern all the way out through the 27th or the 28th of the month, which is very similar to kind of what we talked about on Friday. Guys, this is the map that I drew for the 20th to the 29th time frame. If anything, guys, the trend has maybe been to bring some of this coldest air a little bit further down to the south and to the east. Regardless, the vast majority of the U.S. colder than normal for this time frame. I think the pattern overall will continue to run colder than normal through most of January. You take a look at the next 14 days on the GEFS, next 14 days on the EPS, you can see that here. One potential note to keep in mind with the EPS, it does sometimes struggle with snowpack. It has the tendency to be a little bit too cold in some of these areas with a bigger snowpack down. I think it could be a little bit too cold in here, not quite cold enough across parts of the northern plains. So that is something to keep in mind. The GEFS may have a little bit of a better idea, but regardless, again, you compare these two maps, it's seeing the idea very well as things stand right now. And I think a lot of this is related to a pattern driver that maybe isn't talked about as much, the tropical northern hemisphere pattern, a TNH pattern. And one of the reasons that it hasn't been talked about much is probably because we really haven't seen much of this type of pattern over the past decade or so. Really have just, going back, we saw some of it in the winter of 22-23, but aside from that, we haven't seen a whole lot of it over the past 10 plus years. Back to 2013-14, that's really the last winter that had a super strong positive TNH throughout the entirety of the winter. But what this type of pattern leads to are persistent shots of cold air with storms. When you have what we call the tropospheric polar vortex sitting here over the Hudson Bay, you have a strong cold source of air, and it tends to support blasts of cold, which we have had throughout much of this winter. You take a look at the upper level setup as we go into the week 2 time frame, it mimics this pattern setup nearly identically. If you look here, you've got your positive TNH, your cold air source here. You don't have blocking over Greenland. That is something to keep in mind. But you have a big high pressure over Alaska. It's forcing a lot of cold air down across the U.S. If you look at years that had this pattern, again, 2022 was one. I may have said 22, 23. I meant 21, 22. But regardless, 2022 was one. Then you have to go back to 14, 13, 11, 09. A lot of these years should be familiar. 2014 has been an analog. 2011 has been an analog. 2009 has been an analog. It's not surprising why that they all had this type of a setup. If you take a look at the pattern as we work through January, here's a look at what these years verified at, and overall it's probably going to verify pretty good in terms of how January will average out as a whole. Then the question is, what do these signals look like into February? Years are slightly different. In fact, a couple of recent Februarys actually had some of the positive TNH. But if you look at these years, guys, the one difference between January and February is that the cold air source tends to be a little bit further to the west. There tends to be a little bit more of a southeast ridge. This would be a very active pattern look, guys, that you can see here. But it would tend to put more of the cold air into the central part of the country. You can take a look at these years, guys, and you can see It's cold across the western and central U.S. and a little bit warmer on the East Coast. Very similar to what our current February outlook looks like, by the way. And this was really even before we got deep into this research. And so, seeing some things talking, and this would support kind of the cold idea shifting a little bit further west as we go throughout February. What it would also support is a very active storm track. You know, guys, on the north side of this storm track, it would probably favor a lot of winter storm potential into parts of the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the northern Ohio Valley. And some of these areas, especially Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, northern Illinois, haven't had a lot of snow this year compared to normal. The storm track's been further down to the south. If you look at years even just coming off of the positive TNH in January, it also tends to favor that storm track shifting more from I-70 north instead of I-70 south, like we've had for much of January. And so, you know, I think overall, the consistent signal that we're starting to see, and we can kind of start to see it in here, is that the core of the cold, it's still there into February, but it's a little bit further off to the west. If you look at our tropical forcing analogs back from Friday, overall still supports cold, especially the last week of January. But what does start to happen with these as we go further into February is the cold pulls back a little bit further to the west. You can see that here. Central and western U.S. cold, seasonable to slightly warmer than normal in the east. And if you take a look at the CFS forecast, guys, you take a look at the CFS, I actually think it's doing a pretty good job right now. You can see the cold signal out through the 28th, 29th of the month. What slowly starts to happen, it's still probably relatively chilly in here. Circle an area for you. It's probably still pretty cold across this region, but the southeast ridge begins to make a reappearance. And so you start to get more active. The warmth starts to slowly bleed in to the southeast U.S., and with time it grows a little bit. And I don't really disagree with this type of an idea. Now you'll note there's still high pressure and ridging over Alaska, and so you still have a tap to some colder air, especially behind storms. What it could ultimately mean is a more volatile pattern, more ups and downs, and again, probably the more consistent cold more across the central and western part of the country the further we go into February. You know, I think much of the rest of January is probably pretty cold for much of the central and eastern U.S. I think it's more so into February when we start to see that transition. Regardless, you go back to this here, it's still one that I think can offer up winter weather potential, just maybe a little bit further north in February than it has been in January so far. Guys, that's all I have for today's forecast. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and stay tuned because I think the pattern ahead is going to continue to be very wintry and very notable compared to recent memory for a good part of the country. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.